I want to bring in NBC's Guad Venegas along the border at Eagle Pass, Texas. Peter Baker is New York Times chief White House correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. Mark Short was chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence and is a contributor to NBC's Meet the Press. Also with me, CNBC's Eamon Javers. Eamon, tell us more about the impact these tariffs could have. What about the prices that we pay every day for lots of stuff?
Chris, bottom line is, those prices are going to have to go up if these tariffs go into place. Now, the way the former president always talks about tariffs is he says, I'm going to slap a tariff on China, I'm going to slap a tariff on Mexico. Makes a lot of people think that China or Mexico are paying those tariffs. But the way tariffs actually work is that American importers pay the tariff. The tariff is basically a tax on imports. It's paid by an American company to the U.S. government to bring in those products that you just listed. And then that American company has to figure out what to do. Are they going to eat the cost of that and have that erode their bottom line, or are they going to pass that cost on to their own customers? Typically, they're going to pass that cost on to their own customers, and that will cause prices to rise. Now, at some level, they might eat some of the cost, and so you might have importers really suffering here and taking some of the losses, but those losses have to go somewhere, and a lot of them are going to end up going to consumers.
So, Peter, do we know why President-elect Trump keeps coming back to tariffs? He seems to think of it as this kind of economic magic bullet, but an awful lot of economists say it would actually make things worse.
Yeah, he does look at it like a magic elixir, no question about it. It's the thing he found most appealing in his first term when it came to economic policy, in part because it's something a president can do with his own authority. He doesn't need to go to Congress on this. He already has the executive authority inherent in the office from past legislation to go ahead and slap these things on. And look, this is one of the few core things that Trump actually believes. A lot of his positions on various issues are transactional. He was for abortion rights before he was against abortion rights, before he was kind of for it again, but against it. But when it comes to the idea of trade, the idea of foreign partners who have been, in his view, shafting the United States, that's a core feeling he has been nursing since the 1980s. And so tariffs are his way of expressing national interests as he sees it, America first. And the idea is to protect American industries, give American industries, incentive to do better and do more here at home, keep jobs here at home, and so forth. But you're right. I mean, Eamon is right that this will, of course, cost American consumers. At the same time, the incoming president said that he's going to defeat inflation. And inflation is actually down to around normal level right now, 2%, but the prices haven't come down. It just means that the increase isn't going up anymore, and those prices won't come down if we're putting tariffs on a lot of things that Americans buy.
So, Mark, Trump's nominee for Treasury Secretary wrote about this recently in an op-ed. He said that tariffs can be a negotiating tool with our trading partners. Could that be what's going on here? He's using it as a kind of negotiating ploy.
I think it could be. I think the reality is that I remember when he got Remain in Mexico put in place, that the Mexicans were very opposed to keeping asylum seekers in their country before entering the United States. And when Trump proposed a massive tariff on Mexico, they quickly changed and came to the negotiating table with Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence to negotiate that Remain in Mexico policy. So I think he's actually very effective at this, and I think he uses it for leverage. I agree with what Peter said, though, that the president has vacillated on a lot of issues, but the two things he stayed consistent on are the border and tariffs. And I think that there's some people in marketplace who assume that Bessent will have this sort of calming effect, as I think there were a lot of free traders in the first administration, that there was the Lighthizer, Navarro crowd, and then the Mnuchin, Kudlow crowd, and it gave assurances to market. I don't think that's going to be the case this time. I think that this administration is going to be far more protectionist. I think this is just the tip of the spear of what he's looking to do economically as far as advancing a far more significant protectionist policy. So to answer your question, Chris, yes, I think this could be leverage. It's effective in getting Mexico to play a much larger role, and he's been very good at that. But I also think that this is a pretense of what we should be expecting for the next 4 years as well.
So, Eamon, we all saw what happened to Joe Biden's approval ratings when we saw how high that grocery prices went up, right? The things people use every day. Energy prices is a perfect example of that. Buying a new phone for somebody as a birthday present or Christmas present, very, very common. If indeed he imposes these kinds of tariffs, how quickly could we potentially see what might happen in terms of the prices that people actually pay and the decision that those other governments make about whether they absorb some of it?
Well, it will take some time for this to roll through the economy, no doubt. But you could see prices going up, in a matter of months as people anticipate what's coming and start to shift their pricing, in due course. I mean, if you look at the way this is going to roll out, it's sort of unilateral tariffs from the United States. Then the other countries will probably respond to that with tariffs of their own on things that the United States exports. And so that will cause some friction for U.S. exporters as well. All of that will have ramifications for the economy. And as you say, Chris, what we just learned from this election is that inflation is toxic to incumbent presidents. This incumbent president is going to be different, though. In Trump, too, Donald Trump says he's not running for re-election for a third term. The Constitution says he can't do that. So he might not care necessarily, or he might have a higher political tolerance for pain in the short term up front if he thinks he's going to get what he wants on the back end.
So, Mark, I want to show folks a new CBS poll because we're, certainly it takes the measure of how people are at least feeling about the tariffs. They favor them, Americans, by a slight majority, 52 to 48%. But among Trump voters, look at that number, a whopping 83% approve. Do you think they're just trusting it'll be good? Do you think they could turn quickly if those prices turn quickly, as Eamon points out? What's the potential political risk here?
Well, I think that the president has been very effective, as Eamon said, of telling the American people that people should be paying tariffs in order to get access to our markets and all that the American economy has to offer. And I think that notion is very appealing. But as Eamon said, a lot of people don't recognize that actually it's importers in America that are paying that tariff, and it's often passed on to consumers. And I think the reality is that we haven't had a full-on, significant progressive trade policy since Smoot-Hawley. So I don't think that there's been a real context for what we're probably going to encounter over the next couple of years. So it's understandable, I think, that a lot of people sympathize and say, yeah, to get access to our markets, people should be paying. But I don't think they've really appreciated what the consequences with those price increases could be over time.
So time will tell. But, Gauad, let me go to you. You are in Eagle Pass, and that is where the governor of Texas is, along with the incoming border czar, Tom Homan, Donald Trump's selection for border czar. Talk about how Trump is tying the trade threats to the border and, in particularly, immigration and drugs and the reality on the ground.
Well, Chris, the expectation here is that with these tariffs, Trump and his administration would be pressuring Mexican authorities to enforce immigration on Mexico's northern border. When Trump was president the first time around, Mexico created its National Guard. That's a federal police agency that worked at the border. And a lot of the officers spent time stopping migrants from crossing into the United States. That's the only time we've seen heavy enforcement on the Mexican side with its own officers. This came after Trump had push for that Remain in Mexico immigration policy. And Mexico came to an agreement with the U.S. Now, that has stopped since. In the last few years, we've seen Mexican immigration ease off on that enforcement. When we saw the surge at the border here, we didn't see Mexican immigration officers or the National Guard stop a lot of the migrants that were coming into the U.S. So the expectation here is to have Mexico begin enforcing its immigration laws to stop many of the migrants, and somehow that will motivate the government, right? Because, of course, you're going to have a lot of Mexican companies that are going to be worried because of the tariffs. So the expectation is that Mexico will negotiate by investing once again on its immigration forces. Now, what's interesting to see here, Chris, is that Mexico's National Guard, which was enforcing immigration laws at the border, has now become part of the military as of this year. So before it was a policing agency. So Mexico is going through its own changes. So essentially, they would have to use their military at its northern border if they were to do what they did the first time around when Trump was president.